The ballroom's echo.
Eleanor adjusted the delicate lace of her sleeve, her reflection in the gilded mirror showing a woman composed, if a touch pale. The gown, a sapphire silk that shimmered under the gaslights, was a gift from her aunt, chosen with the hope of a pleasant evening, perhaps even a dance or two. She wasn't prone to grand expectations, especially not where society events were concerned, but the thought of escaping the endless chatter of her aunt's drawing room held a quiet appeal. Her maid, Bess, hummed a tuneless melody as she pinned the last pearl into Eleanor's dark chignon. "You look lovely, my lady," Bess offered, her voice soft. Eleanor offered a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Bess. Let us hope the evening is as charming as your compliments." The air in the ballroom of the Earl of Ashworth's estate was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, overlaid with the sharper tang of expensive perfumes. A string orchestra played a lively waltz, its melody weaving through the murmur of polite conversation and the gentle rustle of silks. Eleanor drifted through the throng, acknowledging familiar faces with a discreet nod, her gaze sweeping the room with an almost clinical detachment. She found a quiet corner near a towering potted palm, observing the ebb and flow of the social currents. Duchesses gossiped behind fans, young debutantes simpered for attention, and gentlemen postured with practiced ease. It was a familiar tableau, one she had long since learned to navigate without becoming entangled in its superficiality. Then, a ripple moved through the crowd. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Lord Alaric, Duke of Blackwood, had entered. His presence was always a gravitational pull, drawing all eyes, not merely because of his immense wealth and power, but due to the formidable aura of detachment he carried. He moved with a predatory grace, his dark eyes scanning the room, settling on no one for long. Eleanor felt a subtle tightening in her chest, a purely involuntary reaction to the sheer force of his personality. She had met him on several occasions, always brief, always formal. There was an unspoken tension that often accompanied their interactions, a silent challenge in his gaze that she met with her own steady, unwavering one. Tonight, however, his focus sharpened with unsettling intensity. His eyes, dark as polished obsidian, found hers across the glittering expanse of the ballroom. He began to move towards her, his stride purposeful, parting the clusters of guests as if they were mere obstacles. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity, the music suddenly seeming too loud, too insistent. Whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, began to spread. Eleanor remained outwardly composed, though a prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. She kept her chin level, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Alaric stopped mere feet from her, his tall frame casting a shadow over her delicate silhouette. His voice, when he spoke, was low, yet carried with an almost cruel clarity that seemed to pierce the hushed air. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his tone devoid of any warmth. "I find myself in a rather inconvenient position." His gaze swept over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his depths before hardening. "It has become clear that our understanding," he paused, the word hanging heavy with unspoken implications, "is no longer tenable." A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. Several women gasped, hands flying to their mouths. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck, but her expression remained impassive. She waited, allowing him to continue, offering him no reaction, no desperate plea, no emotional display to satisfy the voyeurs. He continued, his voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a confidence, yet every word was designed for public consumption. Regrettably, I must withdraw any consideration I might have previously entertained regarding your person." His eyes, cold and unwavering, met hers. "I trust you understand." The implication was unmistakable and devastating. He was publicly dismissing her, severing any perceived connection, effectively branding her unsuitable. In aristocratic society, such a public rejection, especially from a duke, was a social death sentence. It would taint her reputation, making her an object of pity, or worse, derision. 100 eyes were upon her, waiting for a breakdown, a protest, a tearful retreat. Eleanor felt the weight of their scrutiny, but something within her, a core of quiet strength, refused to buckle. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Her spine remained perfectly straight. She offered him not a word, not a single tear, but a slow, elegant curtsy. Her sapphire gown fanned out around her as she dipped, a graceful, almost defiant gesture of respect for the social contract, even as he shredded her standing within it. When she rose, her gaze met his once more. There was no anger in her eyes, no despair, only a profound, almost disconcerting calm. Then, without a backward glance, without a single hurried step, Lady Eleanor Vance turned and walked away, her departure as quiet and dignified as her entrance. The rustle of her silk gown was the only sound for a moment, and then the whispers resumed, louder, more frantic than before. Alaric watched her go, a flicker of something akin to perplexity crossing his stern features. He had anticipated many reactions, tears, anger, a desperate appeal, but not this quiet, unyielding dignity. Her silence, her composure, left him with an unexpected, unsettling void. The victory he had sought felt hollow, tainted by her almost serene acceptance. He found himself staring at the spot where she had stood, the scent of lilies suddenly cloying, the music grating. The ballroom, once a stage for his declaration, now felt strangely empty, echoing with a silence that was entirely hers. The scent of lavender and old parchment clung to Eleanor's drawing room, a comforting shroud against the outside world's sharp edges. Days bled into weeks, each one a mirror of the last. The morning papers, once a source of mild amusement, now lay untouched, their pages undoubtedly teeming with the latest pronouncements on her perceived downfall. The whispers, she knew, were legion, weaving through London's ballrooms and tea parties like a particularly virulent strain of influenza. Yet, within the quiet sanctuary of Vance House, Eleanor moved with an unhurried grace, her spine as straight as the ancient oaks lining her drive. She spent her mornings tending to her neglected correspondence, her afternoons lost in the dense prose of botanical texts, and her evenings playing mournful nocturnes on the grand piano, the melodies a private dialogue with her own unvoiced thoughts. Her companions with a hushed rustle of pages, the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock, and the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart, surprisingly unmarred. Miles away, in the opulent yet strangely sterile confines of Blackwood House, Alaric found his usual meticulous routine disrupted by an insistent, almost physical itch beneath his skin. The incident with Lady Eleanor Vance, a fleeting moment of public dismissal, should have been forgotten, relegated to the vast archives of inconsequential social encounters. He had dismissed countless young women, their pleas and tearful retreats forming a predictable pattern. Eleanor, however, had simply stood there. Her eyes, he recalled with a sudden clarity that annoyed him, had met his without a flicker of shame or anger, only a profound, almost weary understanding. Then she had walked away, her departure as dignified as her arrival. It was her silence, not her protest, that had lodged itself in his mind like a shard of ice. He found himself pacing his study late one evening, the embers in the hearth casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his disquiet. He had expected outrage, perhaps a letter of impassioned defence, or at the very least, a cascade of tears. Instead, there was nothing. The gossip, he knew, had reached a fever pitch, painting Eleanor as a social pariah. Yet she remained conspicuously absent from the narrative, a ghost in her own tragedy. This lack of reaction, this impenetrable silence, was profoundly unsettling. It defied every expectation he held for a woman in her position, a woman he had so carelessly, so publicly, wounded. The following morning, a seemingly innocuous question slipped from his lips to his valet, a man accustomed to Alaric's precise, rarely personal directives. "Have you heard anything regarding Lady Eleanor Vance?" The query felt clumsy, foreign on his tongue. He had intended it to sound casual, a mere passing thought. Instead, it emerged with an urgency that surprised even himself. His valet, an impeccably discreet man named Finch, paused in the act of straightening a silk tie. "Lady Eleanor, my lord. She has, I believe, withdrawn to her country estate. A rather prolonged visit, I understand." Alaric merely grunted, turning to stare out the window at the grey London sky. A prolonged visit. The euphemism was not lost on him. It was a retreat, a self-imposed exile. He found himself imagining her there, amidst the rolling hills and quiet gardens, still maintaining that unnerving composure. The thought, instead of bringing satisfaction, stirred an unfamiliar prick of something. Not regret, certainly not that. Perhaps a perverse curiosity. He wanted to understand the source of her impenetrable calm, to discover if there was a crack in that serene facade. He dismissed Finch with a curt nod, the image of Eleanor's unyielding gaze now a persistent echo in the grand, empty halls of his mind. The silence from Vance's house, rather than fading, was only growing louder in his thoughts. The Duke's shadow. The air, thick with the perfume of honeysuckle and damp earth, offered a sweet contrast to the sharp needle of curiosity pricking Alaric. He stood beneath the ancient oak, a silent sentinel at the edge of Lady Gresham's sprawling garden party, a glass of untouched claret cold in his hand. His gaze was anchored across the lawn to Eleanor. Clad in a gown the colour of morning mist, she conversed with a cluster of dowagers, her posture a testament to rigid grace, a faint, polite smile barely disturbing her lips. Her movements were fluid, her hands loosely clasped, an embodiment of composure. He observed her for a long moment, the society chatter receding to a dull thrum against the relentless pulse of his own thoughts. She lacked overt beauty, the kind that snatched gasps, yet possessed an understated elegance, a serene self-possession he found captivating, disquieting. He had dismissed her, publicly, irrevocably. But her unexpected lack of distress, her unyielding dignity, had planted a thorny seed in his mind, a persistent thing refusing to be uprooted. Now, it had bloomed into this peculiar need to watch, to decipher the mechanism behind her unruffled exterior. "Duke Blackwood, a pleasure!" Lord Hemlock's booming voice shattered his reverie. Alaric offered a curt nod, his attention already re-snared by Eleanor, who had drifted towards the rose garden, her head tilted slightly, listening to a companion. Across the lawn, whispers began to unfurl like tendrils of smoke. "Did you see the Duke?" Lady Ashworth leaned closer to Mrs. Davies, her fan fluttering a frantic beat. "He's been watching Lady Eleanor all afternoon, quite brazenly." Mrs. Davies's eyes widened. "The Duke of Blackwood? But after the assembly last month, I thought he'd quite forgotten her." "Oh, precisely. And now, this. It's most singular. Some speculate he regrets his dismissal, others that he's merely enthralled by her imperturbable manner." Lady Ashworth fanned herself with renewed vigour. "Whatever it is, it's certainly injected some much-needed drama into the season." Eleanor, despite her quiet discourse on new varieties of tea roses, sensed the subtle shift in the air. The sudden hushed pauses, the sidelong glances, the way heads turned just as she passed. She was no stranger to society's undercurrents, the invisible threads of gossip that wove through every gathering. And she was acutely aware of the weight of Alaric's gaze, a palpable pressure across the expanse of the garden. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, like a cool shadow falling over her, even in the bright afternoon sun. She did not turn. She did not falter. Her voice remained even as she discussed the merits of a hybrid tea with Lady Tremaine, her smile as polite and measured as before. To acknowledge him, to react in any way, would be to grant him a victory, to validate his intrusion into her carefully constructed composure. She would not provide him with that satisfaction. Her strength lay in her stillness, in her refusal to be drawn into his orbit through public displays of emotion. Yet, beneath her placid exterior, a flicker of something akin to exasperation stirred. His presence, once a distant, irrelevant fact of society, was now a constant, irritating hum. He was like a persistent fly, buzzing just out of reach, impossible to ignore completely. What did he want? What was the purpose of this sudden, intense scrutiny? Was it merely to gauge her reaction? To confirm the extent of her ruined reputation? As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of apricot and rose, Alaric finally moved, a dark silhouette detaching itself from the oak's deepening shadow. He walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace, weaving through the clusters of gossiping guests, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. He felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetic force drawing him closer to her quiet dignity. The whispers around him grew louder, but he paid them no mind. His world for this moment had narrowed to the woman in the mist-coloured gown, a woman who continued to speak of roses, even as his shadow lengthened to encompass her. Eleanor felt him approaching, a prickle of unease rippling through her. Her breath hitched almost imperceptibly, but her expression remained serene. This was a new game, she realized, one she hadn't anticipated, and she would play it on her own terms. The rustle of silk and the murmur of polite laughter typically heralded the arrival of guests at Lady Ashworth's afternoon reception, but today a distinct stir rippled through the drawing-room as Lord Beaumont made his entrance. He was not a man of overwhelming stature, yet his presence was undeniable, a warm current in the often stifling air of society. Eleanor, observing from a window seat, felt a faint shift in the room's energy, a lightning that drew her gaze. Lord Beaumont moved with an easy grace, his dark hair a stark contrast to his pale cravat, his smile genuine and encompassing. He navigated the chattering groups with a practiced ease before his eyes, seemingly by design, found Eleanor. He approached, his steps measured and confident, a slight crinkle appearing at the corners of his eyes as he offered a small bow. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice a rich baritone. "I trust this afternoon finds you well, amidst such spirited company." He gestured vaguely at a nearby cluster of ladies dissecting the latest scandal with theatrical whispers. Eleanor offered a composed smile. Lord Beaumont? Indeed, the company is never dull. And yourself? As well as one can be, navigating the treacherous waters of social obligation, he replied, a hint of playful weariness in his tone. He settled onto the settee opposite her, his posture relaxed yet attentive. I confess, I've been rather eager to make your acquaintance. Your name, and indeed your fortitude, precedes you. Eleanor felt a faint blush rise. She rarely received such direct compliments, especially ones that acknowledged something beyond her looks or lineage. My fortitude, my lord? Yes, he affirmed, his gaze steady and open. It is a rare quality, particularly when faced with unwarranted adversity. Most crumble or resort to theatrics. You, however, hold your ground with a quiet dignity that is profoundly admirable. His words struck a chord, a balm to the subtle ache she carried. She found herself relaxing, a genuine ease settling between them. You are too kind, Lord Beaumont. Only truthful, Lady Eleanor, he countered, his smile softening. I prefer to speak my mind unvarnished. It saves one a great deal of trouble in the long run. Their conversation flowed effortlessly from there, touching on recent travels, the merits of various poets, and the surprising resilience of a particular rose species. Eleanor found herself laughing, a soft, melodic sound she hadn't realized she'd withheld for so long. Lord Beaumont listened with an engaged intensity, his eyes reflecting her every expression. Across the room, near the grand fireplace, Alaric had been enduring a tedious discussion on agricultural yields. His attention, however, had been drawn, almost against his will, to the quiet corner where Eleanor sat. He watched as Lord Beaumont, a man whose charm was universally acknowledged, leaned in, his focus entirely on Eleanor. And Alaric watched Eleanor, her head tilted, a genuine smile gracing her lips. A smile, he realized, with a sudden jarring jolt, he had never seen directed at him. A cold, unfamiliar sensation coiled in Alaric's gut. It wasn't merely curiosity. It was something sharper, more invasive. He'd dismissed her, publicly, repeatedly. He'd seen her withdrawn, quiet, dignified. But this easy intimacy with another man, this radiant ease, it was a sight he hadn't anticipated, and it stirred a simmering disquiet within him. You look rather preoccupied, Blackwood, Lord Ashford remarked, pulling Alaric back to the conversation at hand. Merely contemplating the nuances of crop rotation, Ashford, Alaric replied, his voice a touch too sharp. He forced his gaze back to Ashford, but his mind refused to settle. He watched Beaumont touch Eleanor's hand briefly as he made a point, a light, almost imperceptible gesture, yet it ignited a spark of something possessive within Alaric. He had dismissed her, yes, but she was his to dismiss. She was meant to remain in that quiet, dignified corner, observed only by him, her silent presence a peculiar fixture in his awareness. The thought of another man seeing that side of her, eliciting that warmth, felt like an intrusion, a theft of something he hadn't realized he valued. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of polite nods and forced smiles for Alaric. The image of Eleanor's soft laughter, of Beaumont's attentive gaze, replayed in his mind like a persistent, irritating tune. He felt a burgeoning anger, illogical and intense. He had never considered Eleanor in such a light, had never entertained the notion of her engaging with another man, especially not one who so clearly admired her. It was a vexing, unsettling realization. The casual disinterest he'd cultivated had fractured, revealing a raw, unfamiliar possessiveness beneath. It was an uninvited emotion, much like Lord Beaumont himself, and Alaric found himself despising them both for it. Gifts and frustration. A small velvet-covered box arrived for Eleanor one Tuesday morning. It rested on the silver tray her maid, Agnes, presented, an unexpected anomaly amidst the usual correspondence and bills. There was no accompanying card, no sender's name etched onto the delicate wrapping. Inside, nestled on a bed of cream silk, lay a single, perfectly formed pearl, its surface shimmering with an ethereal luminescence. Eleanor turned it over in her palm, the cool weight a surprising comfort. An anonymous admirer, perhaps. The thought brought a faint, almost imperceptible frown to her brow. Such gestures were usually accompanied by a declaration, however veiled. This was simply a gift. A beautiful, silent offering. It unsettled her more than a flowery sonnet ever could. Days later, another parcel arrived, this time a rare first edition of a collection of poetry she had mentioned once, fleetingly, in the presence of a few acquaintances. Again, no name, no note. The elegance of the binding, the crisp scent of aged paper, spoke of discerning taste and considerable expense. Eleanor merely traced the gold lettering on the spine, a quiet speculation playing behind her composed eyes. The gifts were becoming more overt, more personal, yet the giver remained cloaked in mystery. The opportunity for a more direct engagement presented itself at Lady Ashworth's annual autumn soiree. The ballroom, awash with the amber glow of countless candles, buzzed with the murmur of polite conversation and the rustle of silk. Eleanor, draped in a gown of deep sapphire, moved with her customary grace, her presence a magnet for curious glances. She was aware of Lord Alaric's approach even before his shadow fell across her. Lady Eleanor. His voice was a low timbre, cutting through the general din. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible bow. A pleasure to find you amidst the festivities. Eleanor turned, her gaze meeting his with an unreadable composure. Lord Alaric, the pleasure is mutual. Her tone was even, devoid of inflection, yet not dismissive. It offered no opening, no invitation for further probing. He paused, a flicker of something unidentifiable crossing his features. I trust you are enjoying the season? Indeed. The weather has been remarkably clement. She offered a small, polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Alaric found himself unexpectedly floundering. He had prepared a number of witty observations, perhaps even a casual query about her recent activities, but her quiet dignity seemed to absorb every conversational gambit he launched, leaving them hanging in the air, deflated. He felt the familiar prickle of frustration, a sensation he rarely experienced. I have noticed you have a fondness for particular items, he ventured, a subtle reference to the gifts. He watched her closely for any reaction. Eleanor merely tilted her head slightly. I appreciate beauty, Lord Alaric, as I imagine do most. Her answer was a deflection, smooth as polished marble. She offered him no acknowledgement of his unspoken meaning, no hint of suspicion or recognition. He tried again, a little more directly this time. Some might say certain gifts require an acknowledgement. Her smile widened fractionally, a gesture that conveyed politeness rather than warmth. Perhaps, but a true gift, I believe, is given freely, without expectation of recompense. With that, she offered another subtle bow of her head, indicating the end of their brief exchange, and drifted away to join a small group by the grand piano. Alaric watched her go, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The frustration was a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. She was an enigma, a puzzle he couldn't solve. Her unwavering composure, her quiet strength only intensified his burgeoning obsession. He had expected anger, perhaps tears, certainly a plea for understanding after his public slight. Instead, she had offered only an impenetrable silence, a dignified retreat that had, ironically, drawn him in deeper. He wanted to crack that composure, to see what lay beneath the serene surface. He wanted to understand why she refused to acknowledge him, to react to his increasingly bold overtures. The anonymous gifts, meant to subtly soften her, had only highlighted her inscrutable nature. And that, more than anything, fueled his resolve. He would not be dismissed. Not by Lady Eleanor Vance. A public confrontation. The Ashworth Estates ballroom glittered under 1,000 candle flames, their dance caught in polished silver and the intricate needlework of exquisite gowns. A hushed hum of refined chatter, punctuated by the delicate chime of crystal and the distant lilting strains of a string quartet, filled the opulent space. Eleanor, resplendent in midnight blue, stood by a tall window, her gaze sweeping over the dazzling scene. Her expression was poised, almost dispassionate, as if she were an observer rather than a participant in the unfolding social drama. Lord Beaumont, a paragon of tailored elegance and effortless charm, appeared beside her, extending a fluted glass of champagne. "Lady Eleanor," he murmured, his voice a smooth baritone, "you possess a unique gift for finding serenity amidst such vivacity." Eleanor offered a faint, graceful smile. "One learns to cherish the quiet moments, Lord Beaumont. They often reveal more." Their discourse, light and captivating, meandered from the vintage's quality to the latest political machinations in Parliament. Beaumont was utterly absorbed, his gaze unwavering, his admiration a tangible presence, a stark departure from the veiled appraisals she usually received. Across the crowded expanse, Alaric, Duke of Blackwood, felt a familiar surge of vexation. He had entered the assembly determined to project complete indifference toward Lady Eleanor, yet his eyes, against his will, had found her instantly. Her composure, even amid the swirling throng, was profoundly unsettling. But it was Beaumont's proximity, his easy laughter, and the subtle inclination of Eleanor's head as she listened, that truly ignited a spark of resentment within him. He moved with resolute purpose, carving a path through the throng of guests. He arrived just as Beaumont was commending Eleanor's astuteness on a point of foreign policy. "Indeed, Lady Eleanor's insights are always distinctive," Alaric interjected, his voice slicing through the pleasant atmosphere like a shard of ice, subtly hinting at superficiality. Beaumont stiffened, a fleeting flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome features before he smoothly recovered. Eleanor, however, remained outwardly imperturbable. Her eyes, the hue of a winter sky, met Alaric's directly, betraying no hurt, no anger, only a tranquil, almost pitying understanding. This unyielding dignity, this refusal to rise to his provocation, only fueled Alaric's internal tempest. "Duke Alaric," Eleanor acknowledged, her voice level. "I trust you are well." "As well as one can be, Lady Eleanor, amidst such effervescence," he retorted, echoing Beaumont's earlier word with a deliberate twist that rendered it an insult. He aimed to provoke, to shatter her calm facade, to ignite some raw emotion in those cool eyes. Instead, she merely tilted her head slightly, a gesture of polite acknowledgement that felt, to Alaric, like a profound dismissal. The air around them thickened, drawing the notice of nearby guests. A hush began to descend, the social currents of the room sensing the escalating tension. Alaric felt a surge of unbidden words rise to his lips, a desperate urge to explain himself, to demand why her quiet dignity so profoundly unsettled him, why her presence haunted his thoughts. He longed to confess the strange, magnetic pull she exerted, the obsession she had become. I find myself, Alaric began, his voice rougher than intended, his carefully constructed detachment threatening to unravel. He took a half-step closer, his gaze locked on her, a desperate plea forming behind his eyes. Before he could articulate the tumultuous emotions churning within him, Eleanor's voice, clear and unwavering, diffused the impending confession. Duke Alaric, perhaps you would be so kind as to share your perspective on the current trade negotiations. Lord Beaumont and I were just discussing the implications for the textile industry. Her intervention was masterful. It was not a plea for rescue, nor a reprimand, but a calm, intelligent redirection, cloaked in social propriety. It was an invitation to a different kind of engagement, one that demanded intellect over raw emotion. The desperate, raw words died on Alaric's tongue, choked by the sudden shift in atmosphere. He felt foolish, exposed, his carefully cultivated image of cold indifference momentarily shattered. Beaumont, regaining his composure, picked up the thread immediately. Indeed, Duke, your insights would be most valuable. Cornered, Alaric could only nod curtly. The moment had passed. He offered a non-committal response about market fluctuations, his mind reeling. He retreated shortly thereafter, leaving Beaumont to resume his conversation with Eleanor. As he walked away, he glanced back. Eleanor was listening attentively to Beaumont, her expression serene, as if the confrontation had never happened. Her control, her unwavering composure, infuriated and fascinated him in equal measure. He had sought to unnerve her, to expose her vulnerability, but in doing so, he had only exposed his own growing obsession. The image of her calm, assessing gaze burned in his mind, a silent challenge he found himself increasingly desperate to meet. The shadow of scandal. The rustle of silk and hushed whispers had been building for days, an insidious current beneath the polished surface of London society. Eleanor, usually impervious to the trivialities of drawing-room gossip, felt its tendrils reach her even in the sanctuary of her family home. Then the morning papers arrived, their headlines stark and unforgiving. A wave of nausea swept over her as she read the bold print, her family name splayed across the page, entangled with vile accusations of deceit, financial impropriety, and a clandestine affair. Not hers, but her late mother's, resurrected from the grave with a chilling precision. False, every word. Yet the accompanying evidence, a series of purportedly scandalous letters, penned in a hand uncannily similar to her mother's, addressed to a disgraced diplomat long since vanished from England, lent an horrifying veneer of credibility. Her father, Lord Vance, a man whose steadfast integrity was as much a part of him as his very breath, crumpled into his armchair, his face ashen. Her younger sister Clara wept openly, her sobs echoing the shattering of their world. Eleanor, though her own heart hammered against her ribs, felt a familiar resolve solidify within her. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. "These are forgeries," she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she reread a particularly damning passage. Mother would never. This language, these sentiments, it's utterly unlike her. Lord Vance looked up, his eyes clouded with despair. Who would do such a thing, Eleanor? And why now? The why now hung heavy in the air, a tacit acknowledgement of the burgeoning connection between Eleanor and Lord Beaumont, a connection that had clearly drawn unwanted attention. The timing was too perfect, too devastating. Across town, the news reached Lord Alaric in his study, delivered by a footman whose usual stoicism was replaced by a visible unease. Alaric scanned the article, his brow furrowing with each damning sentence. His public dismissal of Lady Eleanor had been a strategic manoeuvre, a calculated blow meant to protect her from the deeper machinations of his own family's expectations. But this was an entirely different beast. A cold knot formed in his stomach as he recalled Eleanor's quiet dignity after his rebuff, her eyes holding not anger, but a profound, unreadable sorrow. Now, he understood the true cost of his actions, albeit indirectly. He summoned his solicitor, Mr. Finch, a man renowned for his discretion and his uncanny ability to unearth truths buried deep beneath polite society. "Find out who is behind this," Alaric commanded, his voice devoid of its usual detached calm. "Every detail. I want to know who benefits from Lady Eleanor Vance's ruin." Finch, sensing the unusual urgency in the Duke's tone, returned within hours, his face grim. "Your Grace," he began. "The whispers point to the Ashworths, specifically Lady Ashworth. It seems she views Lady Eleanor as a significant impediment to her daughter's ambitions concerning Lord Beaumont." Alaric's jaw tightened. The Ashworths, their petty rivalries were legendary, but this was an act of pure malice, a deliberate, brutal campaign. The forged letters, Finch explained, had been circulating quietly for weeks, planted subtly among key figures in society, waiting for the opportune moment to explode. They had even managed to implicate Lord Vance in a long-forgotten land dispute, fabricating documents to suggest he had knowingly defrauded a distant cousin. The plot was elaborate, venomous, and designed to utterly obliterate the Vance name. He pictured Eleanor not as the serene figure who graced ballrooms, but as the woman whose quiet gaze had unsettled him, whose composure had silently challenged his own carefully constructed indifference. He had seen the raw honesty in her eyes, the integrity that radiated from her even when his words were designed to wound. To think that such a woman and her family were being systematically dismantled by the vindictive machinations of a jealous rival filled him with a potent, unfamiliar rage. This was not merely about a damaged reputation. It was about destroying a life, an entire lineage. And he, Alaric realized with a jolt that echoed through his very being, had unwittingly played a part in making her vulnerable. The cold indifference he had cultivated for years began to crack, revealing a burning desire to rectify this profound injustice. A duke's resolve. The image of Eleanor, head held high, walking away from the ballroom's hushed judgment, seared itself into Alaric's mind. He had expected tears, a desperate plea, perhaps even a public scene. Instead, she had offered only a silent, dignified retreat that spoke volumes more than any tearful outburst could have. It was that quiet strength, that unyielding composure in the face of ruin, that had splintered the carefully constructed walls around his heart. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He had dismissed her, yes, publicly, unequivocally, but the sight of her retreating figure had awakened a fierce, unwelcome protectiveness within him. This was more than mere propriety. It was a visceral reaction, a primal need to shield her from the very storm he had helped unleash. He found himself pacing his study, the rich scent of leather and old books failing to soothe his agitation. The scandal, orchestrated with such precision, was too convenient, too devastating to be mere happenstance. His initial dismissal of Eleanor had been a knee-jerk reaction, a calculated move to protect his own standing. But now the consequences of his actions weighed heavily. He recalled the flicker of something akin to betrayal in her eyes, quickly masked by that indomitable poise. He had underestimated her, and in doing so had opened her to this venomous attack. The thought of her enduring this humiliation, alone because of his arrogance, ignited a righteous fury. He would not stand by while her life was systematically dismantled. His first stop was the townhouse of Lord and Lady Ashworth, the rival family whose social manoeuvres had grown increasingly aggressive in recent weeks. The Ashworths, particularly Lady Ashworth, had never concealed their ambition for a matrimonial alliance with the Blackwood dukedom. Alaric arrived unannounced, his carriage drawing up sharply before their impressive, if slightly ostentatious, residence. The butler, flustered, announced him as if he were an invading army, which, in a sense, he was. Lord Ashworth, a man whose ambition gleamed in his sharp eyes, greeted him with a forced smile that didn't reach his lips. Lady Ashworth, resplendent in emerald green, affected an air of surprised delight. "Duke Alaric, what an unexpected pleasure," she purred, though her gaze darted nervously between him and her husband. Alaric offered no pleasantries. His voice, usually a measured baritone, was edged with a dangerous quietness that cut through the drawing room's oppressive warmth. "Let us dispense with the charade, Lady Ashworth. We both know the truth about the fabricated letters and the carefully placed rumours regarding Lady Eleanor. Your involvement, and your husband's, is quite transparent." Lord Ashworth blanched, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "My dear Duke, I assure you we know nothing of such scandalous fabrications." "Do you truly believe I am so easily deceived?" Alaric's eyes, usually a calm grey, now held the cold glint of polished steel. "I have sources, Lord Ashworth, sources who are remarkably well informed about the movements of certain individuals in your employ. Individuals who were seen near Lady Eleanor's residence shortly before these scandalous documents surfaced." He watched the colour drain from Lady Ashworth's face. She fumbled with the delicate lace on her fan. "This is an outrageous accusation." "Is it?" Alaric leaned forward, his presence suddenly dominating the room. "Because my sources also indicate a series of clandestine meetings between your agents and a disgruntled former maid of Lady Eleanor's. A maid who, coincidentally, vanished shortly after the scandal broke." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken guilt. Lord Ashworth cleared his throat, beads of perspiration forming on his brow. "Even if, hypothetically, there were such discussions, it proves nothing. It proves motive, opportunity, and the means to commit a libelous act," Alaric countered, his voice like the crack of a whip. "And I assure you, I will pursue this with the full weight of my title and influence. Every legal channel will be exploited. Every servant, every acquaintance, every loose end will be unravelled until the truth is laid bare." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I have no desire to see the Ashworth name dragged through the mud alongside Eleanor Vance's, but make no mistake, if you do not cooperate, that is precisely what will happen." He presented them with a choice: confess their involvement and assist him in exposing the true orchestrators, or face complete ruin. The Ashworths, faced with the Duke of Blackwood's chilling resolve, crumbled. Lord Ashworth, his face a mask of defeat, revealed the name of the printing press used for the forged letters and the identity of the informant who had placed them. Armed with this information, Alaric dispatched his most trusted agents. He spent the next 48 hours relentless, leveraging his network of informants, legal advisors, and even a few less than reputable contacts in the city's underbelly. He meticulously traced the forged documents, found the disgruntled former maid, now terrified and willing to confess, and secured sworn testimonies. By dawn on the third day, a dossier lay on his desk, heavy with irrefutable evidence. The printer's confession, the maid's signed affidavit detailing her coercion, and ledgers showing payments from the Ashworths. It was a complete dismantling of the lie, a comprehensive vindication for Eleanor Vance. His chest tightened with a sense of grim satisfaction, but also a burgeoning hope. He had dismissed her, but now he would move mountains to restore her name. And perhaps in doing so, he might just earn a fraction of the forgiveness he so desperately craved. The battle for her reputation was won. The battle for her heart, he knew, had only just begun. Redemption and promise. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor hummed with a tension that was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the usual festive air of such gatherings. Every eye, it seemed, was fixed on the raised dais where Lord Alaric, Duke of Blackwood, stood before a polished mahogany lectern. The air crackled with a silent expectation, a collective breath held by the assembly of London's elite, many of whom had been privy to, or even participants in, the recent whispers surrounding Lady Eleanor Vance. Alaric cleared his throat, the sound amplified slightly by the room's acoustics. His gaze swept across the faces, lingering briefly on Eleanor, who stood composed and elegant near the arched entrance, a quiet island in a sea of curious gazes. Her chin was held high, her expression unreadable, betraying none of the turmoil he knew she must have endured. It was her unwavering dignity, her refusal to be broken, that had both haunted and fascinated him, ultimately leading him to this precipice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alaric's voice resonated, firm and clear, though a tremor of raw emotion underscored his usual controlled tone. "We are gathered tonight not merely for celebration, but for clarification, for truth." A hush fell, profound and absolute. "For too long, a shadow has been cast, an injustice allowed to fester concerning Lady Eleanor Vance." He paused, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the room. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps a nascent hope, crossed her features, quickly veiled. "I stand before you tonight to unequivocally state that the accusations levelled against Lady Eleanor, suggesting impropriety and deceit regarding the late Lord Vance's estate, are entirely baseless. They are, in fact, the product of a grave error in judgment on my part." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Alaric pressed on, his voice gaining strength, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the assembled gentry. "It was I who, blinded by pride and misled by incomplete information, initially dismissed Lady Eleanor and contributed to the dissemination of these falsehoods. My actions were indefensible, born of a stubborn arrogance I now profoundly regret. Lady Eleanor has conducted herself with unimpeachable integrity, both in her personal affairs and in her stewardship of her family's legacy. Any dishonour perceived to have attached to her name is solely the consequence of my own deplorable conduct. And I beg her, and indeed all of you, for your understanding and forgiveness." The confession hung in the air, a stunning admission from a man known for his impenetrable reserve. Faces in the crowd shifted from surprise to dawning comprehension. Whispers began to ripple, but Alaric raised a hand, silencing them. His voice softened, losing its formal cadence, becoming imbued with a deeper, more personal resonance. He stepped away from the lectern, descending the single step, his eyes fixed solely on Eleanor. But my confession does not end there. He began to walk slowly towards her, the crowd parting instinctively, creating an aisle between them. Eleanor, though outwardly serene, felt a tremor run through her. Her heart, which she had so carefully guarded, began to beat a frantic rhythm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice now a low murmur meant only for her, though the hushed room carried it clearly. He stopped before her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, steady. "My initial dismissal of you, while fueled by misunderstanding, quickly became a torment. Your quiet strength, your unwavering dignity in the face of my cruelty, did not leave me indifferent. It ignited something within me, a profound admiration that blossomed into an undeniable, consuming love. A collective sigh, a mixture of shock and romantic anticipation, swept through the ballroom. Eleanor's eyes, wide and searching, met his. She saw no artifice, no calculation, only a raw, desperate sincerity that mirrored the burgeoning hope in her own heart. "I know I have no right to ask this, after all I have done," Alaric continued, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. He knelt then, a duke on bended knee before all of London. From his inner coat pocket, he produced a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring, a single brilliant sapphire surrounded by diamonds, echoing the deep blue of her eyes. "Eleanor Vance, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Will you do me the immense honor of becoming my wife? Will you allow me to spend the rest of my life endeavoring to prove my devotion, to earn the forgiveness I so desperately seek, and to cherish the love I have found in you?" Eleanor looked down at him, her vision momentarily blurring. The years of quiet suffering, the recent public humiliation, all of it seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his gaze, in the undeniable sincerity of his words. This man, who had once so carelessly wounded her, was now offering her everything. He had risked his reputation, his standing, his very world, to clear her name and declare his love. A soft, genuine smile bloomed on her face, erasing the last vestiges of her composed mask. She knelt with him, meeting him at eye level, her hands gripping his. "Yes, Alaric," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, but resonating with the strength he had come to admire. "Yes, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, the cool metal a beautiful promise against her skin. Their eyes met, a profound connection forming, a silent understanding passing between them that sealed their future. The room erupted in applause, a joyful sound that washed over them, no longer a source of scrutiny, but a celebration of a love hard won, a redemption truly earned.